You're listening to Law, Life, and Culture with Betsy Kim.
Hello and happy holidays. With Hanukkah starting at sunset this Thursday, December 10th, then Christmas in about 2 weeks on Friday, December 25th, it seems like the perfect time for an episode on religion on Law, Life, and Culture. I'm Betsy Kim. Maybe you yourself can relate to this, or perhaps you've often heard friends say they're Jewish, but just culturally Jewish. And similarly, you probably know people or may yourself identify as being Christian, but not particularly religious, but still celebrate holidays such as Christmas. So are there also people who are just culturally Christian? What separates religion from culture? Does truly belonging to any recognized religion require requisite knowledge or scholarship of historical works, sometimes referred to as sacred texts? Or when we take certain actions grounded in beliefs based in religion, are we actually more religious than we know? We're here to talk about defining our religions and ourselves, and we're joined by Rabbi James Ponette, a lecturer in Judaism at Yale Divinity School, and Emeritus Howard M. Holtzman, Jewish chaplain at Yale University. He was the first Yale graduate to serve as Yale's Jewish chaplain. He also co-officiated at the interfaith marriage of Chelsea Clinton and Mark Nesvinsky. The Reverend Stephen Holton, the rector at Christ Church, New Haven, a parish of the Episcopalian Church, joins us. Previously, Father Holton was the associate rector at Grace Church in New York City. He's a graduate of Yale's Divinity School. Welcome to WNHH's Law, Life, and Culture.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thanks so much.
So let's start our conversation talking about the upcoming holidays. Rabbi Ponette, although most people know about Hanukkah, I've heard in the Jewish religion, it's actually considered a minor holiday compared to just say Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or Passover. Can you give us a brief overview of Hanukkah and its significance in your view?
Thanks, Betsy. I'll do my best, and I'll try not to be verbose. First of all, the notion that there are major and minor holidays is worth pondering just for a moment. It's true that Yom Kippur is known in the rabbinic tradition as the day. It's true that the Sabbath, which happens weekly, is a serious holiday. In fact, the definition of a serious holiday from the point of view of Jewish tradition is, you might say that work is not permitted on that holiday. You can work on Hanukkah and you can work on Purim, but you can't work on Yom Kippur. I'm not saying Jews don't. I'm talking about what the law says. You can't work on the Sabbath and so forth. So also Hanukkah is not in the Bible. It's not a biblical holiday. It's the youngest of the ancient holidays. It's a vestige of a war that had both international and civil war type characteristics. Jews were divided at a very difficult time in the aftermath of the destruction of the first temple, which was in the 5th century. We're going a few centuries later. Jews have returned in small number to Judea, but the Jewish people are living on two different major centers in Israel still, known as Judea, under Persian, and then subsequently under the rulership of Alexander the Great and his generals. This will continue up until the time that Rome slips in. But between Rome's taking over control of that part of the world, including Judea, there's a collapse of the empires that were created under Alexander. And for a short period of time, the Jewish leadership, a priestly leadership, waged a guerrilla war, both against Jews that were opposed to their taking this authority into their hands and against the crumbling empire. And they successfully carved out a Judean state. This state had no precedent in Jewish history. It wasn't ruled by a king. It wasn't from somebody from the house of David. It was priests that thought that they needed to stop the gradual process of the disappearance of the Jews into the larger Hellenistic culture. That ended rather shabbily after 60, 70 years of rulership. Rome swoops in. The Jewish kingdom sort of collapses in an internal civil war, and it's gone. But the vestige of the memory that this occurred, that Jews stood up militarily lingered inside of the minds and hearts of the people. And while it ended badly, it also represented a will to political survival. As you can imagine today in Israel, this holiday is a major holiday because it represents exactly what occurred in 1948. The Jews fought to establish a political autonomy in the world. However, after the destruction by Rome, massive destruction, a failed revolt against Rome, two failed revolts actually, the rabbis of the Talmud, that's to say, the successor leaders to the biblical prophets and kings, the rabbis of which people like me are theoretical descendants, although that we consider them to be the great predecessors from which we don't have, while we derive from them, we don't have a living sense of standing in their tracks. Um, Although some of us individuals probably do, but by and large, we know we're not them. The rabbis of the Talmud concluded that this holiday was a dangerous holiday. It could swell the Jews to attempt once again to go against political reality and believing in God or some divine force that intervenes in history, a theme that's relevant to the play and other things that we might get to talk about today. They saw that they needed to neutralize the military side of this holiday, and they created this holiday into a holiday of light. They purveyed the miracle story that doesn't appear anywhere except in the Talmud of oil that was discovered inside of a defamed and defaced temple that was pure and that could be used to light the Hanukkah, or rather the menorah. It wasn't yet called Hanukkah, the Hebrew term that means dedication. So anyhow, the rabbis turned this holiday into a holiday of light and located it at the precipice of winter. And so we have and it's mentioned in the Talmud, very indirectly. Like, oh, by the way, if you're lighting the candles for the Sabbath, what kinds of oils can you use for the actual, the rabbis didn't have candles, they had oil, and wicks. What kind of oil can you use and what kind of wicks? Well, you can use A, B, and C, but not like on Hanukkah. And somebody says, what do you mean not like on Hanukkah? What's Hanukkah? And the Talmud then offhandedly, in 2 pages only out of a couple thousand pages, references this strange holiday and the miracle that we celebrate. So that's the history of it.
Okay.
And we celebrate it for 8 days. It begins, as you said, on the 10th of December. The Jewish calendar, of course, varies in the course of a year, the way the Muslim calendar does as well. Theirs much more dramatically so. It's usually in November or December, and sometimes it overlaps with Christmas, which I think shares this feature of light in the midst of darkness. I'll stop there.
Well, that was very interesting, and perhaps Reverend Holton, you'll explain a lot more of Christmas that I don't know, as I have always seen most people recognizing Christmas as the celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ. But I've also heard that actually the more sacred holiday is Easter, signifying the resurrection of Christ. What's your view in terms of the significance of Christmas?
Thanks, Betsy. So Christmas is important. It's a time of great joy. It also has a lot of cultural significances that may not even be Christian. As Rabbi Pona mentioned, there's this. We're right on the precipice of the darkest night of the year, and so this idea of light coming in, we connect with the star. Easter is certainly for Christians probably a more important holiday because it fixes the complete work that Christ that is about in the world. Not only being born, we say God's word made flesh, but then dying and rising. So Easter celebrates the resurrection. And coincides and draws from Passover, which is such a seminal feast in the Jewish tradition as well. So yeah, that's probably right, that Easter is more important. And I'd like to point out that especially in New England, where I am, it's sort of interesting that we celebrate Christmas now, because there was a time that sort of Puritan colonizers of this area would not have wanted to celebrate Christmas. Folks might get a little too rowdy or drink a little too much or have a little too much fun, and that didn't seem morally right. So Christmas was you could really frown on the celebration of Christmas. The tradition of the 12 days was certainly a British Isles sort of thing of when folks would not work much, would take a Sabbath rest, as it were, and feast and revel and enjoy those times together. And in fact, the 12th night became a big a big party in and of itself. So Christmas is, even though Easter is probably more important in the Christian story, Christmas is important. And it's a time that has strangely become very cultural in our country as sort of a shopping holiday, really. Everyone wants to buy gifts. Santa comes to Macy's on his sleigh, you know, and these things have very tenuous connections to the actual story of Christmas, which is the birth of an infant that the Christians believe is the Messiah. The distinguishing characteristic of Christianity from Judaism is that the Christians believe that baby born in the Davidic line is a king, right in the stable.
Well, that's very interesting. With both of your explanations about the upcoming holidays. Rabbi Ponet, getting back to the idea of the division of Judaism as a culture versus as a religion, do you draw a distinction? And how do you define Judaism?
Thanks, Betsy. Good to listen to you, Father Holden. Glad we're having a chance to talk to each other together this way. Thank you, Betsy, for bringing us together. It's lovely. I think the key point here is the following. There is a Jewish people that traces its lineage back to the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible. And the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible existed as Hebrews before they were, shall we say, covenanted to God at Mount Sinai. Before they became a religious community in a formal sense, where there was a God and there was God's law, and there was a prophet who conveyed that law to the Jewish people. The kind of traditional structure, or conventional structure, what we mean by religion, a public religion, witnessed and so forth. Before that, there were the ancestors of today's Jews. You know, they were the house of Abraham. They were even before Abraham. So they were a people with a history and with a language and with a way of life. And then they bump into, a God, say at Mount Sinai, but only after 400 years of immersion in the pits of Egyptian culture as an oppressed minority population. So there's a history and a people and a language and a memory, and then there develops an evolving religion. I mean, the religion of Moses had no sacrifices in it, although the Torah has them detailed them, but there was not yet, well, I guess there's a wandering sanctuary. So I guess they offered sacrifices in the wilderness. So at any point, there was a stage where Judaism was a sacrificial religion. Animals were offered with different kinds of incantations and prayers, different numbers and different selections of animals for different holidays. And of course, after the destruction of 2 temples, sacrificial cult gives way, prayer comes in, and Judaism becomes a religion of prayer. By the Middle Ages, our philosophical leaders, like most famously Moses Maimonides, tried to turn it into a religion of philosophy. Our mystics turned it into a mystical tradition and come up with a whole other non-philosophic, anti-philosophical way of reading and making sense out of the Hebrew Bible. And we give birth to a system of law. It's kind of adumbrated, vaguely adduced in the Hebrew Bible, but it doesn't tell you what to do on the Sabbath in the Hebrew Bible. It tells you rest on the 7th day. Well, what does rest mean? What does that preclude, and what does that encourage? So I want to say to you that Judaism is foundationally a culture or a civilization which has taken different religious forms and developed different religious understandings, and in many ways, those religious understandings have to do with a second order reflection. What do I mean by second order? I mean thinking about what it is to be a Jew in the world who has a sense of a task that is more than merely survival. And I see Christianity, here I'm being provocative for my new friend and colleague, Father Holton, and that is, I see Christianity as a highly spiritualized and rather doctrinaire form of Judaism, and that in fact Christianity is to Judaism what Buddhism is to Hinduism in a sense, or what Protestantism is to Catholicism. It is a refinement of certain dimensions of Judaism and an abandonment of those that we Jews consider to be absolutely essential. The notion that we are a people, gone. Jew, Greek, Greek, Jew, one under the benign love of the God. And what matters is not the life of the people, but the life of one person, one Jew who barely makes it as a Jew, really, in their thinking historically. And that's, of course, Jesus, the son of Joseph and Mary, who becomes the Christ, the Greek word for Messiah. So, many Jews, the first Christians, of course, were Jews. Paul was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. So, I mean, it's not a bold statement, but we don't normally think of it that way. So Christianity actually represents the separation of the religion, the divorce of religion from culture. And Judaism says, Reform Judaism, which is the tradition I grew up in, tries to go that way as well, by the way. At one stage in its evolution, it denied the existence of a Jewish people. So the notion of religion being separate from culture is a Christian problem. And since I live in a Christian culture, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I could go on, but I think that's my contribution at this point.
So Father Holton, could you respond to Rabbi Ponet's comments and also let me know, according to your understanding of the Episcopalian religion, who you define as a Christian, and if it is not only belief in Christ, but actions in carrying out the word of the New Testament?
Those are two great questions, and thank you, Betsy, and thank you, Rabbi. I agree completely that with the idea that Christianity is started as a reform movement within Judaism, and as Rabbi pointed out, the very first Christians were all Jewish. They were following the law. They were observing practices. They considered themselves part of the chosen people of God. And then what happens next is this idea that everyone else who is outside of the Jewish religion can also follow Jesus, can also follow what the early Christians called the way. So you've got Hellenistic Jews who are all over the diaspora. You've got Greeks, you've got Romans who can become a part of this fellowship. And the first Christians, especially the apostles who were first leaders, really struggled with this idea of Christian identity. How is it? What do you have to do to be Christian? Do you have to observe Jewish laws and not? And then eventually they settled pretty quickly on, yeah, you've got to observe some things that you shouldn't do. Like you can't eat meat that's been sacrificed to idols, because that might mean that you're worshiping some other god than the God of Abraham. Right? So that would be a problem. You can't do that, but you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to have this mark of belonging to a certain people. And so that was a really early on conversation that happened within the body of people who followed Jesus and made Christianity a sort of a missionary religion spreading throughout the world. Where I think we run into trouble is as I think Rabbi is exactly right, that it flips and religion becomes about not a cultural identifier, but a way of being and a way of praxis, a way of following. I think we've gotten into some trouble in our contemporary culture. If we think about, and Rabbi, you referred to living within a Christian culture, we have sometimes talked about, I think wrongly so, America as a Christian nation, which can become problematic when the religion associates with a government or with a power. Then it also begins to collude with the corruption of that power. And we see things like the collusion of the Christian church and of Christian people with sins of racism and anti-Semitism and deep oppression being a part of a dominant culture. So I think what I would call us back to is a recognition of what makes one a Christian. It is to follow Jesus. In the church, we would say that means that one is baptized, but that's just an outward way of marking a relationship with where one understands God to have come and walked among us and to be with us even now. So what makes someone a Christian? Following Jesus.
Okay. So how much do you both feel religion is rooted in, I'll just say it, academic elitism? Originally, the keepers of the faith, I believe, needed to know Hebrew or Latin, and a certain scholarship continues to exist today. And I think this is a good thing because it can distinguish cults from religions. And also, it's an interesting issue because religion is a very powerful force. So I think personally, we'd want to have it rooted in thoughtful, intelligent interpretations and studied ideas. But where do you draw the line in religion in terms of requiring mastery of substantive bodies of thought versus having a general gist of religion, but just more having a good heart? Rabbi Burnett, can we start with you in addressing this?
Thanks, Betsy. Yes. I like what you said, that the elites did have control of the religious traditions. This broke down. Protestantism represented the beginning of the breaking down of that elite in terms of the holy documents that were controlled by being in Latin and being few in number, inaccessible to the masses, by the church. Suddenly, because of the printing press, dissemination became available. There's similar phenomena inside of Judaism. The Talmud is a book that you need to be highly learned and to go in order to enter. Today, not only because of the printing press, but because of the new technologies of communication of written materials. I mean, online, I can read fine translations and English commentaries of the entire Talmud. I can also do that with our mystical books that used to be hidden. So the sense of the democratization, if you will, and the loss of authority in religious life has occurred, particularly in this country. You know, people achieve charisma. People achieve authority through charisma, not through knowledge. And as a matter of fact, the rise of Judaic studies, or the rise of the academic study of religion itself, as a discipline within the university, which is basically barely 200 years old, more like 150 or 19th century discipline, with figures in it, like French and German sociologists and philosophers and psychologists like William James, and up to modernity, have created an intellectual elite that actually lives outside of the church and outside of the synagogue. So now it used to be that the only way you could, for example, become a Jew was through conversion that would be overseen by a knowledgeable authority, a recognized rabbi. But American Judaism is splintered into 3 or 4 or 5 different movements of Judaism, rabbis trained in radically divergent ways with highly divergent understandings of what the law is and what relevance it even has. So what has occurred is that people are finding ways to join Judaism outside of standard authority. Now, this is actually something that Judaism in its own way is at home with. We've never had a pope. Our high court disappeared 2,000 years ago. And so while we have a legal system, it is highly anarchic and democratic. There's no single authority. So it's a joke, but it's also a truth that 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and that the Talmud is actually, not jokingly, a book of argumentation, that there is no creed for being a Jew. There were attempts to create creedal statements, such as Maimonides finally did, and we turned his creed that he published, which was essentially written in Judeo-Arabic, so he intended it for Jews that lived inside of that second language. His legal code, it was in pure Hebrew. We turned his creed, his 13 statements of what it is that a Jew must essentially believe, into a song that is sometimes sung, i.e. no catechismic status. So so the question is fascinating and important, and I think that a lot's at stake in terms of religious authority. I think that's what you're talking about, and you seem to conclude that some authority in the hands of an elite might be good. This suggests a political orientation on your part, where perhaps democracy is a little bit dangerous as one sees when populist leaders gain control. Maybe there's a wisdom to having a U.S. Senate and a Supreme Court, sometimes known as a counter-majoritarian part of the American government. So anyhow, that's my babble in response to your fine question.
So Father Holton, can you also respond on this issue?
Yeah, so there's a certain there's a long tradition of scholarship within the Christian faith, sure, as in the Jewish tradition. But I want to remind us that the first Christians were not scholars. They were, in fact, not dominant parts of the culture. They were craftsmen and fishermen, and the earthly father of Jesus is a carpenter. They were tax collectors and folks that were sort of they were the poor. They were slaves. There were some wealthy merchants. There were some other wealthy people, even folks who were part of the Roman military that became part of the way of the early Christian movement as time went on. But this did not start as a dominant religion, and it certainly didn't start from centers of learning. Though within a few centuries, centers of academia like Alexandria became places of thought within the Christian tradition. There's a certain amount of constructive project that exists within Christianity. If we look at Christian scriptures, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in particular, Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular, go back into Hebrew scripture, into the Torah to say, look at these, or into the prophets, look at what Isaiah said, and look at how Isaiah is pointing to Jesus as the Messiah. So there was a constructive argument that they were making within their day. And the creeds come out of that sort of an argument. So there is an intellectual project to understanding who God is and how Christians talk about God. But I would submit that while that might be useful for a bishop or an ecclesiastical leader to know, it is not as necessary for a person who identifies as Christian to know. The most important thing for Christians to know is that God has made the world, that God loves the world, that God comes to be with the world, and that God is in the process of saving and redeeming the world. And anyone in any intellectual capacity can grasp those concepts. And that's the only thing that the creeds and scriptures are telling us. That's the thing that they're driving towards.
So Father Holton, I did want to follow up with you on that, in that I know there are people of both faiths who believe in larger truths of the Bible as collective wisdom of humanity over the centuries. And some self-identifying Christians say Christ's resurrection for them is more of a powerful metaphor of important ideas he professed that don't die because they continue to live on in future generations. Is that then not truly religiously Christian, or does it pose slippery slope concerns? Because if people start with their own interpretations, when does it stop? What do you think?
Well, sure. The Christian story, the Christian religion is absolutely mad if you look at it on paper. This is a dead person rising, right? It seems biologically impossible. I think that is an important thing that Christians hold to, however, because that's the great mystery, is that God triumphs over death in this great act of resurrection. And I don't think that would have been as strange in 2,000 years ago to hear. There were other stories of resurrection, but it is certainly strange in our modern period. And sure, there will be some Christians for whom that is metaphorical. A more orthodox view is that is a literal thing that happened.
Okay.
There was literally a person called Jesus who walked, lived, died, and rose. And we came to understand that this person was actually the Christ, the Messiah, the Greek word for Messiah.
Okay. So similarly, Rabbi Ponet, can you address the importance of adhering to specific Jewish beliefs or practices? And I'm reminded of the musical Fiddler on the Roof with Tevye's monologue and song tradition, where he explains the need to adhere to religious traditions to maintain balance in society.
Thank you. I think just as Father Holton distinguished between the Orthodox view and other views, where the other view allows for the metaphor, one sees this already a couple thousand years ago in the heart of the Talmud. A non-Jew comes to Rabbi Shammai and says, "I would like to become a Jew. Convert me into being a Jew, and teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot." And Shammai throws him out. He says, You insult me and you insult my religion. I've spent a lifetime and still have not mastered it. He then goes to Rabbi Hillel, and Rabbi Hillel says to him, he says to Hillel, teach me the whole thing while I'm standing on one foot. And Hillel says, sure. That which is hateful to you, don't do to your friend. All the rest is commentary. Now go study. So he didn't say anything about observing the Sabbath. He didn't say anything about eating food that is kosher or not kosher. He didn't say anything about eating matzah on Passover. There were no laws. It was simply a matter of self-awareness. He didn't even mention God. And so he distilled it that way. There had been different distillations of what Judaism is over the years. Indeed, the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, as we sometimes call the Haredim, tend to see the essence of what it is to be a Jew in obeying all of the laws. And there are great arguments against obeying the laws as being the center, both inside of the language of the prophets and scripture, most famously in the Middle Ages in Moses Maimonides, who made the stunning philosophical observation for which many Jews burnt his books, that you could observe all of the laws, but if you believed that God was in any way corporeal, said the great Spanish-based, until he was driven out and took refuge in Egypt, philosopher Maimonides, if you believe that God is in any way corporeal, you're an idolater. So the spiritual integrity of the Jew for him was achieved through belief and knowledge, not through behavior. But that view never became totally dominant. Maimonides is received in the tradition because he wrote a total legal code. So he could talk against the centrality of law because he'd earned the right by producing the most encompassing code of law that is still referenced on every page of the Talmud to this day.
Okay. Well, Rabbi Ponat, I want to extend this question to the more delicate issue of interfaith marriages. I understand the sentiments some of my friends have expressed about staying within their faith. Their intention is to preserve the Jewish culture and people. But can you discuss your views of tradition in this context?
I can, thank you. Yeah, there were many years, from most of my rabbinate, in fact, I did not perform such marriages, and I usually explained it to myself, I think not with full clarity to myself, that Judaism, unlike Catholicism, by the way, has no law that of marriage that can accommodate a Jew marrying somebody who's not a Jew. It's simply a relationship. A sexual relationship, perhaps, but not a marriage. So I hid behind that. But the deeper truth was that I bought into the sociological assessment that intermarriage was contributing to the disappearance of the Jewish people. And there are very few of us in the world. It's always intriguing in this part of our country to ask how many Jews do you think there are in the world. If you ask it in Montana, you might get, 10,000. In this part of the country, you might get, 1 billion. But of course, the number hovers somewhere between perhaps 12 million and 15, 16 million. So the sense that the people is vulnerable, highly vulnerable, contributed to my sense that I couldn't do it. But as I looked around and as I served as a rabbi, more and more people came to me and said, I'm in love with so-and-so who's not a Jew. And will you do the wedding? And for quite some time, I said, no, I'll help you get a rabbi who will do it. I'll get you a justice of peace and so forth. And I'll help you design your own wedding so that you can, but I can't do it. And I finally saw through that. I realized that the continued existence of the Jewish people matters deeply to me, but the fundamental responsibility of the Jew is not to keep Jews alive, but to bring love and light and blessing to the world. That's why we're here. And so when there's a conflict between bringing love, light, and blessing to the world and keeping yourself in the world, that's a hard one. So I guess the other adjustment was I'm no longer fully convinced, based on sociological data, that couples who intermarry disappear. In fact, I've seen so many couples who have done that, who have developed a living and beautiful and magnificent way of being Jewish in the world. So the story is far more complex than our demographers thought. And the fear of non-existence is not a good motive for most actions that I consider to be Jewish.
Well, this is law, life, and culture, highly intertwined subjects being discussed with Yale's emeritus Jewish chaplain, Rabbi James Ponette, and the rector at Christ Church, Stephen Holton, on WNHH 103.5 FM. And I'm Betsy Kim. Well, I just finished Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He has a PhD in history from Oxford and teaches at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So he crosses terrain, I think, familiar with both of the two of you for this conversation. But I found both of these books fascinating. And he was raised in the Jewish faith, but emphasizes a very secular perspective. For people seeking more religion, Harari points out the sobering thought that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and the planet Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, and humans existed for about 2.5 million years, and Judaism, measured by the existence of the Jewish people, is 13,000 years old, and Christianity, if looking at the AD calendar, is then 2020 years old. So how do you reconcile the role and place of Christianity and Judaism in this timeline? Father Holton, can you be the first one to take on this discussion point?
Well, I'll try. The story of God is for Christians somewhat about God continually revealing God's self and being in relationship with all of creation. So, I suppose for a Christian, we're a blip on the map, as it were. Judaism is much older, and the history of the world is much older than this particular belief system. But God is not. God is always. Christians will talk about God is before all things and creating out of nothing. Even the creatio ex nihilo is a doctrine. So if God is always there, God has always been loving the world and creating and about the work of creation. And we're simply tuning into that. We're simply coming to receive that revelation as people have for centuries in lots and lots of different ways and lots of different traditions.
Okay. In 2012, Father Holton and I went to the play Grace, written by Craig Wright, who was my downstairs neighbor. And Father Holton, you pointed out it was a modern day telling with a twist of the story of Job. And coincidentally, Rabbi Ponette has taught a course on the book of Job at Yale Law School. And I love Job because I think he resonates with so many people. His travails convey this timeless feeling of this seeming lack of justice in this world at times. And this sense of, why me? I've worked hard. I'm honest. I'm a nice person. Why do I have to suffer like this? And in a quick synopsis, in this play, a devoutly religious man, a born-again Christian, Steve, gets looped up in some shady real estate deals, and his wife falls in love with a neighbor who is disfigured in a tragic car accident, and she plans to leave him. But unlike Job, Steve gets a gun and kills both of them, and then himself. Now, Father Holton, I'm going to ask you if you can read the final lines of what Steve says on page 55 of the play text before he commits this final act of atrocity. And if you can, could you tie in the story of Job with what people are searching for in God and how that actually does connect with the greater universe that the character Steve, as well as Yuval Noah Harari, reference?
I'll do my best. let me pull that document up. Here we are. Okay. So this is right before Steve has walked into the house where Sam, the other man, and Steve's wife are, and Carl, who is an exterminator, has walked in, and Steve has just shot and killed Carl. So a warning that there's a murder in this play. And just after he shoots Sam and he's speaking to his wife, Sarah, Steve says, God, one night I went out under the stars. The stars? Because a lot of people had what, told me something? because some people had told me something. I went outside and looked up at the stars. I spoke to them like you would to a person, and they talked back. I would give anything to forget they did, but I can't. I talked to the stars, and they talked back, and something shot through me. It did, down through the top of my head like an upside down fountain, and I was filled for the first time with a sense of love. Universal love. And so I did what any poor, stupid, helpless human being would do. I changed everything. I reorganized my entire life around this universal love that I thought I saw, that I thought I felt. It felt like the most perfection and beauty I'd ever felt in my life. And this is how it ends up. And it's at that point that he raises the gun towards his wife. That's a powerful, hard scene in that play, and I think out of context, I love that idea of being filled with this universal love and this beautiful image. But you've asked me to tie it to Job, but I hate. Rabbi, forgive me. This is your text, not mine. So I want to tread lightly here. It seems to me that what has happened in Steve and what can happen in certain parts of Christianity or any faith for that matter is that, well, but I've done all the right. Earlier, there's another passage quite a lot like this one, another little soliloquy where Steve says, but I did all the right things. I went to Sunday school. I went to church. I learned all the scriptures, and I met this beautiful woman, and I married her. And somebody had promised me all this money to build these hotels. It was all supposed to be okay. C.S. Lewis rather famously said in God in the Dock that he never went to Christianity for happiness or for comfort. He always knew a bottle of port would be better suited for that. I think what happens here is, for me, what happens with Job. Steve is surprised that he might have suffering in his life, that things might go wrong. God never promises to alleviate or take away our suffering, but only to be with us in the midst of it. And somewhere Job knows this, or comes to learn it in some way. I think at that moment of the whirlwind, I think Job has that realization. But so I think that's what's going on here, is that Steve has an expectation of reciprocity, that he's been a good boy, and so he's been a good person. Well, Jesus says, who is good but God alone? There is real suffering, and that can't be wiped away. That's evil. There's just evil in the world.
Okay. So, Rabbi Ponette, drawing into the book of Job with a modern context, that's why I brought in that play, which Reverend Holton read from. Can you talk about what you teach about the book of Job, its key points, what people today are supposed to get out of the story, and whether it illustrates an essential aspect of Judaism in helping people live better lives?
Thank you. I'll, as Father Holton said, I'll try. First of all, let me just say, Father Holton, your reading was stunning, beautiful, very theatrical. If you ever need an alternative to your ministry, or you could perpetuate your ministry in another mode. I mean, you're on stage, you're incredible. Thank you. That went through me like bullets. So I'm going to be somewhat provocative here, but then your choice of bringing this play was also a provocative move, Betsy. So what it highlights for me is that the aggressor in the book of Job is God through the agency of Satan. God attacks his beloved Job. So the notion that one would attack someone that one loves is in the book of Job. It's also in the book of Hosea, quite horribly. In fact, you could say it's a motif in Jewish history. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, God says to Abraham, and offer him up. So the notion that we might batter our beloveds, which apparently is an exacerbated problem today as we live under conditions of isolation, spousal abuse and interfamily violence, common. So the notion that love and violence have nothing to do with each other is belied by the world that we live in and by the text that we study. I'm afraid that it's a centerpiece of Christianity. The point is, God kills his son or allows his son to be killed, sacrifices his son as if to fulfill that which Abraham wakes up and doesn't kill his son. And God says to Satan, who says, let me mess with him. Let me batter his skin. I'll show you. He'll curse you to your face. And God says, okay, just don't kill him. All right. So the notion that murder is never, alas, absolute in our traditions, because Christianity in its way and Judaism in its way both validate war. There's proper killing. There's capital crime. There is an argument against that. Anyhow, so that's part one. Job and the lessons of Job. So I think the most important lesson from the book of Job is not that God is with you. It's that the friends turn up. The friends turned up. And although they were not particularly attractive in their failed attempt to comfort a man who was inflamed with the rage and anguish of the injustice he had suffered, he argued with them. The amazing act of murder that didn't occur in the book of Job isn't that God didn't kill him. He could have died of his wounds. It's that he didn't kill himself. It is a miracle that Job survived his own rage that was directed both at God and at his friends. And he survived it. I think he survived it because of his friends. The Talmud thinks so as well. It says either friendship or death. And one of the examples of that is Job and his friends. They didn't think that Job's friends were comforters. They had failed, and not that the art of comforting requires one who's willing to be comforted. Much easier to give comfort than to receive it. But they did turn up. They came from foreign countries, and they sat for 7 days in silence with Job. They listened, and then they talked too much. So they failed, but they were there. And their turning up was enough. There were those who would say that God's turning up was the key. I'm not so sure about that because of what God actually says. Basically, you think you can be a friend of mine on reciprocal terms? You think you can get me to do what you want? I got news for you, buddy. I will give what I want to give, and I will take what I want to take. Pretty much like you said after you first got hit, Job. You were good at the beginning. God gave, God took. You also said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. So at the deepest level, Job knows that his life is a gift from God. But he not only didn't kill himself, he goes on living a long time, becomes a great-grandfather. Not only that, well, the conclusion, which Betsy, I think you noted, is unconvincing, a Hollywood ending. The beautiful part of the ending isn't that everything is restored, because it isn't. His wife doesn't come back. Not clear where she went. I think their marriage fell apart. Doesn't say. And of course, his children are not resurrected. This is a new set of children. So he's still living with loss, like a Holocaust survivor who's lost everything, but has come to this country and started over. That's Job.
Okay.
But what's amazing, I'm almost done, is that he recognizes the beauty of his children. He establishes an intimacy with them that had not existed in the first iteration of Job, the beginning of the book. Job learns the recognition of beauty and the experience of love and human love and human beauty, and that keeps him alive. That's my reading.
Okay. You know, we have about 1.5 minutes left, and so I want you both to answer this two-pronged question. If you can share one Hanukkah or Christmas act you'll take this year, what would that be? And then what would you ask individual people listening to this program as an act to take this holiday season? And don't make the latter one too difficult because I'm going to take it to heart. Okay? Rabbi Ponette, do you want to start? And then Father Holton?
Sure, thanks. I think since Hanukkah is the holiday of lights, what I would say is the most important light that we have is captured in that song, which functions as a major anthem during the civil rights movement, although its origins may not have been as a Negro spiritual. And that is this little light of mine. I'm going to make it shine. And I would say that the major act of Hanukkah is indeed to let the light of my face be visible to as many people as I bump into on purpose or by accident. and to be that source of light. And that would be what I would urge each of us to seek to do, to be a source of light and magnify the little we got to share with others.
Father Holton?
Thank you, and happy Hanukkah, Rabbi.
Thank you so much. And Merry
Um,
Christmas, Father.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I'll do and that we will do together at Christ Church as a community via live stream, as well as even in an in-person outdoor gathering on Christmas Day, is to tell again the story of the infant Jesus, of what Christians consider God coming to be among us. In flesh, fully human and fully divine. We'll read again the story from the Gospel of Luke. And I encourage Christians everywhere to do that again this holiday season with, if you're here alone, if you're with family on Zoom, wherever you find yourself, read that story again and listen to how fantastic and crazy it is that God comes into a world that is broken and suffers the pains of evil and death, and yet still triumphs over it. There is hope in the world, and that is something that we can shine forth and share, that love, that hope with the world.
Well, thank you very much, the Reverend Stephen Holton and Rabbi James Ponette, for being our guests on Law, Life, and Culture. And to our audience, we appreciate your joining us. I'm Betsy Kim.
Ciao, Betsy.
Thanks, Rabbi. It was nice to be with you.
Oh, it was a pleasure to be with you, Stephen. I'm glad we got to meet this way. Post-pandemic, let's make some time to actually see each other. It'd be wonderful.
I look forward to that.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.